They say blood is thicker than water, a bond that is supposed to be our ultimate sanctuary, the one thing in this world that never breaks. We are taught from birth that family is everything, the beginning and the end, the people who would do anything to protect us. But what happens when that protective instinct curdles? What happens when protecting our own becomes a justification for the unthinkable? When a family's love transforms into a cold, calculated obsession that demands the total erasure of another bloodline. In the quiet, rolling hills of southern Ohio, where the Appalachian foothills begin to rise, the night of April 21st, 2016, felt like any other. The air was cool, the stars were sharp, and the deep silence of rural Pike County was broken only by the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. But in 4 separate homes nestled along the winding gravel of Union Hill Road, that silence was about to be shattered by a methodical, clinical execution. 8 people, 3 children left alive in the arms of their dead mothers. No money stolen, no jewelry taken, only a message written in lead. For 2 long years, a whole state would hold its breath, wondering who could be capable of such a monstrous feat. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was a family mission. This is the story of the Pike County Massacre, the most complex, expensive, and haunting investigation in Ohio's history. A story of how a dispute over a single child led a family of 4 to become a mobile death squad, proving that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the very ones who will lead you to your final rest. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Pike County, Ohio, is a place where time seems to move a little slower. It's a landscape of vast forests, sprawling farms, and tight-knit communities where your surname carries the weight of generations. Life here isn't always easy. The economy has its struggles, and many families get by through scrapping, doing whatever hard physical work is available to keep the lights on. It's a place where everyone knows everyone. And yet, there are hollows and back roads where a person can disappear into the shadows if they truly want to. At the heart of this community was the Rhoden family. Christopher Rhoden Sr., 40 years old, was the patriarch. To those who knew him, Chris was a man of constant motion. He was a man's man, hard-working, skilled with his hands, and deeply devoted to his children. He lived in a trailer on Union Hill Road, often working on cars or demolition projects. His ex-wife, 37-year-old Dana Rhoden, was the family's emotional anchor. Despite their divorce, Dana and Chris remained close, co-parenting their 3 children with a level of harmony that many envied. Dana was a nursing assistant at a local care center, known for her tireless work ethic and her wide, infectious smile. She was the kind of woman who would work double shifts just to make sure her kids had everything they needed. Their children, 20-year-old Frankie, 19-year-old Hannah, and 16-year-old Chris Jr., were her world. Frankie was a young father himself, living nearby with his 20-year-old fiancée, Hannah Gilly. They had a 6-month-old son and were building a life together in the same rural enclave. Hannah Rhoden, the middle child, was 19 and possessed the same fiery, independent spirit as her mother. She was beautiful, sharp-tongued when she needed to be, and fiercely protective of her infant daughter, Sophia. To the outside world, the Rhodens were a typical, large, extended family. They had their secrets, like the small-scale marijuana grow operations Christopher Sr. managed to supplement their income, but in Pike County, that wasn't uncommon. They were loved, respected, and above all, they were many. A few miles away, another family lived a very different kind of life. The Wagners, Billy, his wife Angela, and their 2 sons, George IV and Jake, were a contrast to the Rhodens' open, talkative nature. The Wagners were insular. They were a closed circle. They didn't just live together. They functioned as a single, multi-headed organism. Billy was a man who preferred the company of his dogs and his equipment to people. Angela, the matriarch, was the undisputed commander of the household. She was a woman who demanded total loyalty, managing the family's finances, their schedules, and, most importantly, their secrets. Her sons, George and Jake, were raised in this environment of absolute control. They were homeschooled, kept away from the corrupting influences of the outside world. Jake, the younger son, was particularly close to his mother. He was quiet, perhaps a bit sullen, but he possessed a single-minded intensity that would eventually become the family's undoing. The two families were destined to cross paths through the most common of ways, a teenage romance. When Jake Wagner was 17 and Hannah Rhoden was only 15, they began dating. It was the kind of intense, all-consuming love that only happens when you're young. For a while, the families merged. Hannah spent time at the Wagner farm. Jake was a frequent guest at the Rhoden trailers. In late 2013, Hannah became pregnant. When Sophia was born, it seemed like the bond between the families was sealed in blood. But behind the scenes, the friction was already beginning to smoke. The Wagners didn't just want to be grandparents. They wanted control. Angela Wagner, accustomed to being the only voice of authority in her sons' lives, found herself at odds with the independent-minded Hannah Rhoden. Hannah wasn't a Wagner. She wouldn't be told how to raise her daughter, what to wear, or how to think. When the relationship between Jake and Hannah eventually soured and broke in early 2015, the closed circle of the Wagner family didn't just tighten, it turned into a trap. They began to view Hannah not as the mother of their grandchild, but as a threat to their legacy. In the Wagner household, a terrifying philosophy began to take root. If you can't control them, you eliminate them. For the Wagners, little Sophia was a prize that had to be won at any cost. And as the custody dispute began to simmer, the Wagners stopped seeing the Rhodens as neighbors or friends. They saw them as an obstacle. They began to watch. They began to plan. They began to calculate how many lives it would take to ensure that Sophia Wagner would never have to spend another day in a Rhoden home. The hills of Pike County were quiet, but in the Wagner farmhouse, the air was thick with a darkness that no one saw coming. Jake was different from the other boys. He was focused. He didn't party much. He didn't run wild. He was a Wagner, after all. He seemed to offer Hannah a kind of stability, a promise of a future that felt safe. And for Hannah, who grew up in the whirlwind of the large, loud, and sometimes chaotic Rhoden clan, that stability was magnetic. By the fall, the relationship had accelerated. Hannah became pregnant, and on November 28, 2013, she gave birth to their daughter, Sophia. At first, the birth seemed to draw the two families even closer. The Rhodens welcomed Jake into their trailers. The Wagners opened the doors of their farmhouse to Hannah. But it was here, in the transition from a teenage romance to the reality of a shared life, that the first cold shadows began to stretch over the couple. Hannah and the baby moved into the Wagner home. It was a massive, working farm, a place of hard labor and strict routine. To the Rhodens, who lived with a live and let live philosophy, the Wagner household was a revelation. It was a kingdom, and Angela Wagner was its queen. In the beginning, Hannah tried. She really did. She wanted to be the perfect mother, the perfect partner. But the honeymoon period didn't just end. It was methodically dismantled. The Wagners didn't just want Hannah to live with them. They wanted to reconstruct her. Angela Wagner began to implement what the family called the rules. They weren't suggestions. They were mandates. Hannah was told how to dress, modestly, strictly. She was told how to speak. She was told how to care for her own daughter. Angela would take Sophia for hours, dismissing Hannah's choices on feeding, sleeping, and even the clothes the baby wore. Jake, instead of standing by his girlfriend, became his mother's enforcer. The quiet boy Hannah fell for was replaced by a man who was constantly hovering. constantly monitoring. He was like a shadow that never left her side. If she wanted to visit her mother, Dana, Jake had to be there. If she wanted to call her brothers, the conversation was often overheard. One of the most chilling red flags emerged during this time. Jake began to obsess over safety, but it felt more like surveillance. He wanted to know where Hannah was every second of every day. He didn't want her having a life outside of the Wagner fence line. To the Rhodens, who saw family as a support system, the Wagners saw family as a fortress, and Hannah was increasingly treated like a prisoner rather than a resident. The tension eventually reached a breaking point. Hannah Rhoden was a Rhoden through and through. She had a spine of Appalachian steel. She couldn't be broken. She refused to dye her hair the color Angela demanded. She refused to stop seeing her own family, and most importantly, she refused to let the Wagners own her daughter. In early 2015, the perfect union finally shattered. Hannah took Sophia and moved back into her mother's trailer. She thought she was escaping, but for the Wagners, this was a declaration of war. Jake's behavior shifted from possessive to predatory. He began a relentless campaign to get Sophia back. He would show up at the Rhoden trailers, demanding his daughter. He began documenting every fault he found in the Rhoden household. The presence of pets, the supposed lack of cleanliness, anything he could use in a court of law. But it wasn't just about the law. Inside the Wagner home, the air was turning toxic. Angela and Billy Wagner didn't see a young mother trying to raise her child. They saw a corrupting influence who was stealing their bloodline. They began to monitor Hannah's social media, tracking her every move. When Hannah started dating again, first a young man named Corey Holdren, the Wagners' fury reached a fever pitch. To them, the idea of another man being around their Sophia was an unforgivable sin. Hannah, sensing the danger, wrote a message to a friend that would later become a haunting piece of evidence. She said, "I'll never sign papers. They'll have to kill me first." It was a phrase she likely used as a figure of speech, a testament to her resolve. She had no way of knowing that for the people she once called family, those words weren't a warning. They were a roadmap. The Wagners began to realize that as long as the Rhodens were alive, they would never have total control over Sophia. And in their world, total control was the only option. The honeymoon was over, and the planning had begun. Down the road, Frankie Rhoden and his fiancée Hannah Gilly were tending to their young family. Their 6-month-old son, Ruger, was teething, and their 3-year-old was full of that restless energy that only toddlers possess. And then there was Hannah Mae. At just 19, she was a mother for the second time. Her newborn daughter, Kylie, was only 4 days old, a tiny, fragile life that Hannah cradled with a fierce, protective love. For the Rhodens, the day was filled with the mundane tasks of survival. They had no idea they were living through their final hours of peace. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the Union Hill Road, another family was beginning a very different kind of routine. At the Wagner farmhouse, the atmosphere was clinical. There was no nervous energy, only the cold focus of a mission. For months, Billy, Angela, George, and Jake had been preparing for this night. They had purchased a specific truck, modified with a hidden compartment under the floor to stow their weapons. They had bought brass catchers to attach to their pistols, so no shell casings would be left behind. They had even purchased specific shoes from Walmart, shoes they intended to burn as soon as the work was done. In the week leading up to this night, the two brothers, George and Jake, had dyed their hair a dark, muddy brown to better blend into the shadows. They checked their gear one last time: the masks, the ammunition, and a sophisticated device to jam cell phone signals, ensuring that even if someone woke up, they would find themselves in a digital void, unable to call for help. Around 11 p.m., the mission began. Billy, George, and Jake climbed into the truck. Angela stayed behind, the commander waiting at the base. They drove toward Union Hill Road, the tires crunching softly on the gravel. They knew the layout of every trailer. They knew where the dogs slept. They knew exactly who was inside. The first stop was the trailer belonging to Christopher Rhoden Sr. Inside, Chris Sr. and his cousin Gary were likely unwinding after a long day. The Wagners moved with a terrifying, practiced silence. Using a key they had likely acquired or simply knowing the door was unlocked, they slipped inside. Billy Wagner went first. He was the patriarch, the one who would take down the Rhodens' leader. Chris Sr. wasn't asleep. He was in the kitchen when the door opened. There was a brief, violent struggle, the only one that would happen that night. Billy fired. Chris Sr. was hit multiple times in the head and torso. Gary Rhoden, caught in the crossfire, was executed where he stood. The silencers muffled the cracks of the .40 caliber bullets to nothing more than heavy thuds. As Chris Sr. lay dying on the floor, Billy and his sons didn't stop to look back. They had a schedule to keep. The next stop was Frankie's trailer just a few hundred feet away. Frankie and Hannah Gilly were asleep. The Wagners entered with the same ghostly precision. They walked past the room where the 3-year-old was sleeping. They entered the master bedroom. Frankie and Hannah never woke up. They were shot in the head as they lay side by side. Between them, 6-month-old Ruger was sleeping. The killers didn't touch him. They left him there, splattered with the blood of his parents, a silent witness to a horror he was too young to understand. From there, they moved down the road to Dana Rhoden's trailer. This was the home of the primary target, Hannah May. Inside were Dana, Hannah May, her newborn, and 16-year-old Chris Jr. The Wagners split up. Jake went for the room where Hannah May was sleeping with her 4-day-old daughter. He had once claimed to love this woman. He had fathered a child with her. But as he stood over her in the darkness, there was no hesitation. He fired 5 times. Hannah May Rhoden was killed instantly. Her 4-day-old daughter, Kylie, was tucked into her side. When the police found her hours later, the infant was still trying to nurse on her dead mother's breast. In the other rooms, Dana and Chris Jr. were also executed in their beds. The Wagners moved through the house like shadows, checking each pulse, ensuring the job was complete. The final stop was miles away, at the mobile home of Kenneth Rhoden. Kenneth was Chris Sr.'s brother. He lived alone, a quiet man who kept to himself. The Wagners drove the long stretch of dark road, the adrenaline of the night beginning to settle into a cold, hard resolve. They entered his home while he slept. A single shot to the head. Methodical, clinical, final. By 4 a.m., the Wagners were back at their farmhouse. They stripped off their clothes and shoes, feeding them into a fire. They cleaned the truck. They disassembled the silencers. They had successfully executed 8 people in 4 different locations in a single night. They believed they had committed the perfect crime. They believed they had saved Sophia. But as the sun began to rise over Pike County on the morning of April 22nd, the silence of Union Hill Road was about to be broken. Around 7:53 a.m., Bobby Jo Manley, Dana's sister, pulled into the driveway. She had come to feed the family's dogs. She walked into the first trailer, and the screaming began. A screaming that wouldn't stop for years. At approximately 7:50 a.m., Bobby Jo Manley, Dana Rhoden's sister, pulled her car into the gravel driveway of Christopher Rhoden Sr.'s trailer. This was her routine. She came every morning to help with the chores and feed the family's dogs. She expected to hear the familiar sounds of the morning, the barking of the hounds, the clatter of a coffee pot, Chris Sr.'s voice shouting a greeting. But as she stepped onto the porch, the silence felt wrong. It felt thick. She pushed the door open, and the world as she knew it simply ceased to exist. In the kitchen, the air was metallic and cold. Christopher Rhoden Sr. was on the floor. There was so much blood. So much that Bobby Jo initially thought he had been beaten or that an appliance had exploded. A few feet away, Chris's cousin, Gary, lay in a similar state of ruin. "There's blood all over the house. I think my brother-in-law is dead. He's on the floor. It looks like someone beat the hell out of him." Bobby Joe didn't wait for the sirens. She knew her nephew, Frankie, lived just down the road. She climbed back into her car, her tires spitting gravel as she raced toward his trailer. She was looking for help, but all she found was more shadow. She burst into Frankie's home, shouting his name. No answer. She pushed open the bedroom door and was met with a sight that would haunt the state of Ohio for a generation. Frankie Rhoden and his fiancée, Hannah Gilly, were dead in their bed. Between them, 6-month-old Ruger was awake. He was covered in his parents' blood, but he was alive. He was reaching for them, crying softly in a room that smelled of copper and gunpowder. "I'm at Frankie's now. They're both dead in here. There's 2 more. My nephew and his girlfriend. There's blood everywhere." When the first deputies arrived, they found a scene that defied logic. They began a sweep of the area, moving from one trailer to the next, their weapons drawn, expecting an active shooter to jump from the woods. But there was no shooter. There were only the quiet houses. At Dana Rhoden's trailer, the horror reached its zenith. Deputies found Dana, the family's heart, executed in her bed. In the next room, 16-year-old Chris Jr. had been killed. And then they reached the back bedroom. There lay Hannah May, 19 years old, the woman the Wagners had decided didn't deserve to breathe. Beside her was her 4-day-old daughter, Kylie. The infant was unharmed, a tiny living miracle in a house of the dead. 3-year-old Brentley was also found alive in another home, wandering through the trailers, looking for a mother who would never wake up. As the news spread, Pike County went into a state of total lockdown. Schools were closed. Businesses shuttered their windows. The local sheriff, Charles Reeder, stood before the cameras, his face pale, advising the remaining members of the Rhoden family to arm themselves. The message was clear. There was a monster in the woods, and no one knew where it would strike next. The search for answers was immediate and massive. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, BCI, took over the scenes, turning the quiet gravel roads into a high-tech fortress of yellow tape and forensic tents. It was the largest crime scene in Ohio history. Investigators spent 5 straight days processing the trailers, documenting every blood spatter, every footprint in the mud. But the perfect crime was holding. No shell casings were found. The brass catchers the Wagners used had worked perfectly. There were no fingerprints that didn't belong to the family. No DNA from an outsider. For the survivors, the search wasn't for evidence. It was for safety. The Rhodens were a massive family, but suddenly they felt small. They gathered in hotels, protected by armed guards, wondering if they were next. They looked at their neighbors with suspicion. They looked at the hills and saw only hiding places. And a few miles away, the Wagners watched it all on the news. They watched the grieving families. They watched the helicopters circling. And they sat in their farmhouse, quiet and contained. They had the child they wanted. They had the silence they required. Or so they thought. The search was only just beginning, and it would eventually lead the authorities to a trail of Walmart receipts, dyed hair, and a family bond that was about to be tested by the weight of 8 lives. But for months, there was nothing but a haunting, heavy silence. The initial theory that gripped the media and the community was a professional hit. Because of the sophisticated nature of the killings, the silencers, the lack of shell casings, the clinical precision, authorities initially looked at the marijuana grow operations found on Christopher Rhoden Sr.'s property. They wondered if a cartel had moved in, sending a message to a local competitor. It made for a gripping headline, but for the lead investigators, something didn't sit right. Cartels are loud. They want the world to know they were there. But this was quiet. This was intimate. The killers had walked past high-value items. They had left thousands of dollars in cash untouched, and most importantly, they had spared the infants. A professional hit squad doesn't tuck a newborn into a dead mother's side. Only someone who valued those children would leave them alive. The focus began to shift from the hills to the family tree. Detectives started looking into the lives of the Rhodens, looking for the friction points. And every road they traveled eventually led back to a single name: Sophia. As investigators dug into the digital life of Hannah Mae Rhoden, they found the evidence of a brewing war. They found the messages about her refusal to sign custody papers. They found the screenshots of the Wagners monitoring her every move. And then, they noticed something strange about the Wagners themselves. While the rest of the community was paralyzed by grief and fear, the Wagner family seemed busy. Within months of the murders, they did something that no one in Pike County could understand. They sold their farm, the legacy they had claimed to cherish, and they packed up their entire lives. In the spring of 2017, the closed circle of the Wagners didn't just move. They vanished. They drove 4,000 miles north across the Canadian border and into the frozen isolation of Alaska. To the Wagners, it was a fresh start. To the investigators, it was a neon sign of guilt. They didn't just leave, they ran. State and federal authorities began an unprecedented surveillance operation. They didn't just follow the Wagners to the wilderness, they listened. Using sophisticated wiretaps and hidden microphones planted in the Wagners' vehicles, detectives began to hear the cracks in the foundation. They didn't hear a direct confession, not yet, but they heard a family speaking in codes. They heard Angela Wagner managing the story. They heard the tension between the brothers. But knowing isn't the same as proving. The BCI needed physical evidence, and the Wagners had been meticulous. The breakthrough finally came when investigators turned their attention to the months before the murders. They began combing through thousands of hours of surveillance footage from local businesses and scouring the digital footprints of the Wagner family's purchases. They found the smoking guns in the mundane records of big-box retailers. They discovered that Billy Wagner had purchased a very specific pair of faded glory shoes from a Walmart shortly before the killings. Shoes with a tread pattern that perfectly matched a bloody print found on a floor at one of the Rhoden trailers. They found records of the family purchasing a 1990s Ford truck, a truck that was never seen again after the night of the massacre. And then, they found the most chilling piece of the puzzle. Buried deep on the Wagner property, long after the family had moved to Alaska, investigators discovered a homemade silencer and a large, custom-built false floor for a trailer. The Wagners hadn't just committed the crime, they had built a mobile command center to carry it out. They had practiced their shots. They had studied the Rhodens' sleep patterns like a military unit studying an enemy. In November 2018, the trap finally snapped shut. Billy, Angela, George IV, and Jake Wagner were arrested. The charges were staggering: 8 counts of aggravated murder, each carrying the possibility of the death penalty. The godmother of the family, Angela, was taken into custody along with her husband and sons. The investigation had revealed a terrifying truth. The Wagners had functioned as a domestic death squad. They had spent months planning the perfect erasure of another family, all to ensure that one little girl would grow up entirely within their control. They had weighed the lives of 8 people against their own desire for ownership, and they had decided the price was worth paying. But as the trial loomed, the closed circle was about to face its final test. Because while the Wagners were unified in blood, they weren't all unified in silence. The arrests of Billy, Angela, George IV, and Jake Wagner sent a shockwave through Ohio. It was the moment the community had been praying for, yet the horror was far from over. The legal battle that followed was as complex and grueling as the investigation itself. For nearly 3 years, the family maintained a united front, pleading not guilty, while the state meticulously built its case, piece by piece, from Walmart receipts to homemade silencers. But on April 22, 2021, exactly 5 years to the day after the massacre, the closed circle finally broke. Jake Wagner, the man who had once claimed to love Hannah Mae Rhoden, walked into a courtroom and did the unthinkable. He took a deal. In exchange for the removal of the death penalty for himself and his family, Jake agreed to tell the truth. He sat in that witness stand and for hours reconstructed the nightmare. His confession was clinical, almost hauntingly detached. He described how they had studied the Rhodens' habits, how they had calculated the exact time it took for the trailers to fall silent. He admitted to pulling the trigger on 5 of the 8 victims. He spoke about standing over Hannah Mae, the mother of his daughter, and firing into her head while their infant lay beside her. He confirmed the family's motive was purely, terrifyingly simple: absolute control over Sophia. The confession was a knife to the heart of the Wagner defense. Angela Wagner followed soon after, pleading guilty to conspiracy and burglary, admitting her role as the architect of the family's obsession. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison, a sentence that ensures the matriarch will likely never breathe free air again. But George Wagner IV, the older brother, chose a different path. He refused to plead. His trial in late 2022 became a national spectacle, a window into the dark soul of a family that had turned into a cult of personality. For weeks, the prosecution laid out the evidence. They showed the kill truck, they presented the ballistics, and they brought Jake to the stand to testify against his own brother. George's defense was simple. He was there, but he didn't kill anyone. He claimed he was a victim of his family's dominance, a man who went along because he had no other choice. But the jury didn't buy it. In Ohio, if you help plan a murder, if you provide the transportation, if you stand guard while the triggers are pulled, you are just as guilty as the man with the gun. In December 2022, George Wagner IV was found guilty on all 22 counts, including 8 counts of aggravated murder. At his sentencing, the judge's words echoed through the silent courtroom. You were a part of a family that decided they were judge, jury, and executioner. You didn't just kill individuals, you attempted to erase a bloodline. The final tally of justice was staggering. Jake Wagner, 8 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. George Wagner IV, 8 consecutive life sentences plus 121 years in prison. Angela Wagner, 30 years for her role as the mastermind. Billy Wagner, currently awaiting his own day in court, facing the same grim fate as his sons. The Wagners had wanted to own Sophia's future. Instead, they had traded their own lives for a legacy of infamy. They had built a fortress to keep the world out, but in the end, the walls they built became their prison cells. 8 lives taken, 3 children left to grow up in the shadow of a massacre, and a family that once lived by the code of blood is thicker than water now sits in separate cells, waiting for the end. They say an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind. And looking at Pike County today, it's hard to disagree. The trailers are gone. The crime scenes have been cleared. But the silence that remains is different now. It's a silence filled with the weight of 8 lives taken for the sake of ownership. The Wagners will rot in their separate cells, surviving on the scraps of a legacy they burned to the ground. They are a family that was supposed to be a sanctuary, but instead, they became a cult of erasure. As for the Rhodens, they remain a memory of a family that was loud and many and full of life, until they met a family that was quiet and few and full of death. Ultimately, the Pike County Massacre stands as a chilling reminder that the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones hiding in the woods. They're the ones sitting at the dinner table, whispering about loyalty and planning the unthinkable in the name of love. Because when a family decides that their blood is the only blood that matters, everyone else is just standing in the way. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.